Please welcome Matthew to the Hang Time stage.
Thank you for the intro. My name is Matthew. I'm a software product designer at InVision. I spent the majority of my career before that working on enterprise software at IBM and a little bit at Apple and then back to IBM. And I think the most important thing that I've learned about being a designer is that it's less about me and the work that I can do and more about how I can help my team and the company push the conversation forward and get the best work out of the teammates that surround me, whether that's more other designers, software engineers, or the product managers that we collaborate with every day. And to that end, I'm going to talk today a little bit about motion design and how you can more successfully and more responsibly build motion into the software products that you create every day. So just like great UI and great UX and interaction design, motion has become an essential ingredient in today's modern web and mobile applications. Motion can communicate progress. It can establish relationships, for example, between state A and B. And it can provide clarity into where we want to go next. When done well, great motion feels obvious and even invisible when we experience it. But pulling this off in production is sometimes quite complex, and it takes a unique collaboration between designers and engineers. There's a big difference between crafting a beautiful animation for the purposes of exporting it as a video and doing that same motion, testing it with customers, and eventually shipping it out to production. But because there's a big gap between these two, it doesn't mean that we can't do it. In fact, we should do it with a healthy and collaborative process. Just like any other design discipline, UI, UX, interaction, whatever, motion is simply a set of decisions. And those decisions can be codified and broken down and built back up into a system that we can reuse. So today, I'm going to talk less about the ins and outs of what motion is, what the principles are, and how you can build it, and more about some tips and lessons in collaboration. So I have 4 lessons that I've learned through my own work and from the many customers of InVision. Some of you are probably here today that I've spoken with about how to work better with your teammates to ship motion. The first lesson is to animate at the start of your design process. So as soon as you're ready to start making, I would encourage you to think through motion while you're sketching or wireframing. This is a great opportunity to bring some of your collaborators, like engineers and PMs, into the fold early, get them bought in, make them feel like it's their idea and they're a part of the process. So they're much more likely to help you out later on when you're building this together. For example, you can take any of your sketches, whether you're drawing on paper or making this digitally like this with freehand, and drop it into Keynote, drop it into Studio or your favorite tool of choice, and begin animating. So you can do really simple things like just showing this, sliding in and out. And it's a surprisingly effective and obviously low-cost way of communicating the basics of an idea right at the start of your process. Next tip around animating early is to allow these thoughts of animation to influence other decisions around your UI, and not always the other way around. So for example, this little mock application called InSpace, we're starting to see that there's some shared elements between state A and B. And let's say we popped open this menu here, and we saw this animation, something really common. But what's next? Now that we're starting to animate, we can start to see that, hey, if I click on one of these planets, those are also in state A. So maybe instead of just going from A to B and then to C, I might pass back through A, grab an image of that planet, and then end up at my C. Lastly, you're at this point, and my last tip for animating early is to start mocking up these motion decisions as soon as you're moving into high fidelity and comping up your designs. While this is still just representing a picture of your design, it's not the actual product that you're going to ship. That's totally okay, because at this point in your process, you're still just trying to align yourself and make sense of this. Does it make sense to you? Does it make sense to your teammates? Does it make sense to the stakeholders that are bought into this project and invested? And if you use a tool like Studio and InVision, any decision that you make is instantly shareable a link away for your developers when it comes time for them to start building this in code. Which brings me to lesson 2, prototyping in code. No matter how detailed you get with your static comps and your mockups and your prototypes, like I was just showing, it's pretty hard to get actionable, really valuable user feedback. And it's infinitely more valuable to watch customers use the real thing. So I have a couple examples for you. We're going to take a step forward, and instead of looking at that mock application in space, we're going to take a look at a real project that we were working on at InVision. So we have, obviously, if you push a prototype up, you can start playing it. And we started building a motion inspector, so you can go find out any of the details around the motion that you created in Studio, or your developers can go find out. And we were looking for more ways into that particular feature. How do we make it more discoverable? How do we make it more intuitive? As they're playing the prototype, can they just right-click and inspect like they would do in a normal browser inspector tool? And while this was pretty okay to mock this up, this is just done statically. There's no code here, right? And we started to hit a wall because in a tool like this that we're building, there's not one flow to go through the tool that we can hope that our users are going to make. At any point in time, there's 1,000 decisions that they could take through our tool and different ways to navigate. So in this case, we took some of those same features and we actually built it out in production. And at this point, we're now able to watch customers use these little featurettes that we're building, as well as all the intricacies of the tool that already exists, like playing the prototype, changing the speed, tossing on loop, etc. And like I said before, it is so much more valuable to just watch customers use the real thing. Now, I'm about to contradict myself a little bit, so I apologize. While we did build this out in production because of how complex it is, prototyping in code doesn't mean that you always need to build it right into the production app. Sometimes just getting it in the medium that your customers will experience it in is enough. Again, let's take a step back to this mock example of this in-space mobile app. So this is relatively the same thing that you can do in Studio, but now you can start to create systems and shared language around what this animation is. And the niceties of code means that I can take this mixin that I've created over here called stagger, and if the motion's not feeling right, it's not doesn't work quite as well as we wanted it to while we watch customers use this, I can just change a couple simple values. I can change 400 milliseconds to 600, and then cascade the delay of 200 milliseconds and change that to 4. And then on the right, we can see a completely different result. The items are moving in slower, and their staggered delay is a little more spread out. So, prototyping in code. Moving on, like you saw, as we were moving higher and higher in fidelity, we started to give that animation a name. So lesson 3 that I've learned about building motion into your product successfully is develop a shared language around the building blocks that make up any piece of motion that you're going to ship. So consider what it means to break these things down and start to define. So if we look at really any motion that you find in your favorite software apps, Lyft, Headspace, InVision, etc., you can kind of break it all down to this. There's properties like moving, scaling, fading, rotating. What's the behavior? There is duration, and we can talk about this in terms of fast, slow, medium, extra slow. There's easing, which we can talk about in terms of in, out, or maybe even something a little more abstract like, hey, let's set the easing to entering, or let's set the easing to exiting. And there's delays. Just like duration, we can say short, medium, long, and sequencing. Do we want these two properties to animate at the same time, or one after another, or in reverse? And the pattern here is that I'm not describing animations in terms of this thing is 400 milliseconds and the Bezier curve is 0.121, 0.1619. Like that doesn't get you closer to developing a shared language. But using some simple terms and creating a system does. So using this thinking, I could say, hey, I want this card in my application to scale from 100 to 120% at a medium speed, exiting shortly after it starts moving out to the left. And if we've given meaning to these terms and systematized this, another designer I say this to, or an engineer on my team will know exactly how to build this. And it might look something like this. Let's play it again once more slowly. So you can see that it moved out at a medium speed. It started growing shortly after it started moving to the left. So I didn't say that it moved at 400 milliseconds or that it started growing 200 milliseconds after it started moving, and I didn't describe the Bezier curve surely like this at all. That would be kind of ridiculous. I said it moved medium, it was exiting, and it shortly after it started moving. It growed shortly after it started moving. So while this is a really simple example, there's opportunities that you can take this to the next level. And what I mean by that is there are certain parts of your application where you might want to change tone. Maybe for this example, you wanted those things to be quick and snappy, but at another time, you might want something to be a little more celebratory. And instead of having to take what we just did and recalculate all those values manually, and then re-explain all those values manually, and try to just hard code them, we can say, hey, at the global theme level, what we have on the left here, that was productive use. It was quick, snappy, non-distractive. But let's pass in a theme at the global level and say, we want that same exact animation, but we want it to be more celebratory. It might be a point in our application where we're rewarding the user for something they did. And so instead of making these changes individually one by one and hard coding it, you can see that just saying we want the same exact thing but celebratory gives us a different result. And it might look something like this, which is going to be kind of hard to tell the difference. But maybe if I can jump back and play it again. So things move a little slower. There's a little bounce to the animation. And so just simply using common language and saying, I want this thing to be a little different, that's all it takes. And that's the benefit of developing a shared language. Moving on. Just like you use all the apps you use today, they might have a color theme. You can choose between light or dark. Or if you're using like a spreadsheet application, you might be able to choose your custom preference between something that's comfortable, something that's default, or condensed, meaning like I'm changing the vertical spacing of rows, for example. Now imagine doing the same thing for motion, whether, like I said, you choose to make that decision for your customers, or maybe you give that power to your customers and you let them choose how they want to experience your application. Do they want it to be super quick and snappy and productive? Maybe that pairs well with the condensed rows. But maybe a different customer wants it to be more loose, open, and they want their animations to be a little more animated. I'm going to move on to lesson 4 here. This is the last lesson that I've learned about collaboration while building motion design, and that is to always consider inclusivity, and accessibility when building and shipping motion into your software. The first part of this is considering assistive technology. Let's take an example of Lyft, ride-sharing app. How many of you have used Lyft or Uber? Right? Probably everyone. Don't use Uber. So they have a lot of interactions in their app, like when a driver's pulling up, and it'll give you a little toast notification that'll animate in, something like this. Boom, it animates in. They want it gone so it's not distracting you from the rest of your experience. And as normal, able-bodied people, like the most of us here in this room, we're privileged enough to experience that and be just okay. But if someone was using assistive technology and they had that turned on their phone, the screen reader didn't even have enough time to do its job before that notification was dismissed. So something that I've been able to learn from talking with the designers at Lyft is that they have to consider what it means to add a minimum delay or duration to their notifications like this, so to give ample time for the screen reader to do its job, to read the actual text that's on the screen. And if they want to get even more intense and more fancy, they could develop a programmatic system to have contextual lengths of depending on what the content is. Moving on. Last example of the day, and the last part of designing inclusively and accessibly is to consider how we can be more responsible when designing UI in motion. This is my favorite example of all, and it comes from our good friends at Headspace. They created a new experience for meditation to help people fall asleep easier. They call it sleep, aptly named. And what I found amazing about this is that they truly considered the mind state that their users would be in and let that drive their decisions around UI. They wanted it to be a little darker because their users are probably going to have their phones dimmed. They need to make sure they have ample contrast on their text, just like every other user, but even more so because their phones are going to be dimmed. And guess what? These people are probably about to fall asleep, or they're at least using this to try and get in a state where they can fall asleep. So the motion shouldn't be snappy, quick, intrusive. It should be really smooth and flowing, etc. And if you want to learn more about this example, and really anything that I'm talking about today, I didn't work on it, but InVision just released a really awesome handbook digitally. You can go to designbetter.co/animation-handbook, or take out your phone right now and a real-world use case of QR codes. Imagine that. Point it here, and a link will just pop up, just your regular camera. Go check out this handbook. It's awesome. It'll have most of what I just talked about and more. And yeah. So, wrapping up, if we as designers, working with the rest of our team, collaborating with engineers, product managers, and all the stakeholders and VPs and executives that are invested into what we make, if we can start animating at the beginning of our design process, prototype in the actual medium that our customers are going to experience our product in, develop a shared language for ourselves, our collaborators, our team, and our entire company, and make sure to build things inclusively and accessibly, I believe that we can start prototyping and building motion and shipping motion a little more responsibly. Thank you.